The morning sun cast long shadows across the Portland Flower Market as Staff Sergeant James Cooper stepped out of his black Toyota Camry. He was dressed in simple civilian clothes, a clean white t-shirt, blue jeans, and comfortable running shoes. Even in casual wear, his military background was obvious from his straight posture and alert eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings, a habit formed during his 3 tours in Afghanistan. The market was already busy, even though it was only 8:30 in the morning. Sunday was always the busiest day, with people coming early to get the freshest flowers. The air was filled with sweet fragrances from hundreds of different flowers, and Cooper couldn't help but smile. It was so different from the harsh environments he had experienced during his deployments. Today's mission was simple: find the perfect bouquet of yellow roses for his mother's birthday. Sarah Cooper had raised him alone after his father died in a car accident when James was only 10. She had worked 2 jobs to make sure he had everything he needed, never complaining, always encouraging him to follow his dreams. Yellow roses were her favorite, reminding her of the sunshine she said James brought into her life. Cooper walked slowly between the stalls, taking in the colorful displays. Old Mrs. Chen, a regular vendor he recognized from his previous visits, waved at him from her corner stall. She was a tiny woman in her 70s who always wore a wide-brimmed hat to protect herself from the sun. Her flower arrangements were known to be the best in the market. "Good morning, Sergeant Cooper," she called out cheerfully. Even though he had told her many times to call him James, she insisted on using his rank. She said it was her way of showing respect for his service. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Cooper replied with a warm smile. "How are your grandchildren?" "Ah, growing too fast," she laughed, adjusting some pink carnations in a display. "Little Tommy started kindergarten last week. Are you looking for something special today?" Cooper nodded. "Yellow roses for my mother's birthday. I was hoping you'd have some of your best ones saved." Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up. "Of course, I have fresh ones that arrived this morning." Perfect timing. She disappeared behind her stall and emerged with several stunning yellow roses. As Cooper examined the flowers, he noticed a young couple at the next stall buying lilies for their wedding. The woman was explaining to her fiancé how each flower had a special meaning. Her excitement reminded him of how his mother used to teach him about different flowers in their small backyard garden. The peaceful morning atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. Cooper's trained ears picked up the sound of at least 3 bikes, and they were getting closer. He didn't think much of it at first. Motorcyclists often passed through this part of town on weekends. He returned his attention to the roses, carefully selecting each one as Mrs. Chen helped him build the perfect bouquet. She added some baby's breath and green ferns to complement the yellow roses, her experienced hands working quickly but carefully. "Your mother will love these," Mrs. Chen said confidently, wrapping the bouquet in cream-colored paper. "They mean joy and friendship in flower language, you know." Cooper smiled, reaching for his wallet. The motorcycle sounds were getting louder now, and he could tell they were approaching the market. Years of combat experience had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, and something about the aggressive way these bikes were being revved made him slightly uneasy. As Mrs. Chen was giving him change, the first bike appeared at the market entrance. Cooper watched from the corner of his eye as 3 large motorcycles, their engines unnecessarily loud, pulled into the market's parking area. The riders wore leather jackets with patches that he didn't recognize, but their body language sent clear signals. They weren't here to buy flowers. Cooper thanked Mrs. Chen and took the bouquet, but he didn't leave. Instead, he pretended to examine some nearby sunflowers while keeping the new arrivals in his peripheral vision. His instincts, honed by years of military service, were telling him that this peaceful Sunday morning was about to become much more interesting. The 3 bikers dismounted their motorcycles with deliberate slowness, their heavy boots scraping against the pavement. The leader was a tall man with a thick, untidy beard and arms covered in tattoos. His 2 companions were shorter, but heavily built, wearing matching leather vests with patches that read "Night Wolves." Cooper continued examining the sunflowers, but his mind was already mapping out the market area like he used to map combat zones. He noted the positions of all the vendors, the exits, and any objects that could become obstacles. It was a habit that had saved his life more than once in Afghanistan. The bikers walked through the market as if they owned it. Other shoppers quickly moved out of their way, parents pulling their children closer. The peaceful Sunday atmosphere had changed in seconds, replaced by nervous whispers and worried glances. Well, the leader's voice boomed across the market. Looks like it's time for our monthly collection. He stopped at the first stall, where an elderly woman was selling orchids. Cooper recognized her as Mrs. Park, who had been selling flowers at the market for over 20 years. Mrs. Park's hands trembled as she arranged her flowers, trying to avoid eye contact with the bikers. The leader leaned over her display, deliberately knocking over a small pot of purple orchids. The pot shattered on the ground, and several people nearby jumped at the sound. "That's unfortunate," the leader said with a cruel smile. "Accidents like this happen when people don't pay for protection. Isn't that right, boys?" His companions laughed, one of them kicking the fallen orchid. Mrs. Park's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent. Cooper's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He had seen bullies like this before, both in high school and in war zones. They were all the same, cowards who picked on those weaker than themselves. The second biker, a man with a shaved head and a scar across his chin, started moving through the market, holding out a dirty baseball cap for donations. Most spenders reluctantly dropped money into it, their faces showing a mix of fear and anger. Mrs. Chen caught Cooper's eye from her stall. She gave him a slight shake of her head, silently pleading with him not to get involved. She had seen incidents like this before and knew how dangerous these men could be. But Cooper couldn't just stand by and watch. His mother had taught him to stand up for what was right, and his military training had given him the skills to do so. He carefully set down his yellow roses on a nearby table, making sure they wouldn't get damaged. The third biker, the smallest of the group but still muscular, noticed Cooper's movement. He nudged the leader and pointed. "Hey, boss, look at this guy, standing there all straight and proper like he's something special." The leader turned his attention to Cooper, leaving Mrs. Park's stall in disarray. He walked toward Cooper with heavy steps, trying to appear intimidating. Cooper remained perfectly still, his face calm but his muscles ready for action. "You got a problem, pretty boy?" the leader growled, stopping just a few feet from Cooper. The smell of leather and cigarettes filled the air between them. Cooper noticed how the leader kept his right hand near his jacket pocket, probably hiding a weapon. He also noticed that despite their tough appearance, none of the bikers moved like trained fighters. They relied on fear and intimidation, not skill. The market had gone completely quiet. Everyone was watching, holding their breath. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. Mrs. Chen had her phone in her hand, probably already calling the police. "I think," Cooper said calmly, his voice carrying clearly in the silence, "that you gentlemen are the ones with a problem." His words were polite, but his tone carried the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. The leader's face turned red with anger. Nobody had dared to stand up to him in months, and he wasn't about to let this start now. Behind him, his two companions spread out, trying to surround Cooper. They didn't realize they were making exactly the kind of amateur mistake that Cooper had been trained to exploit. The leader of the bikers stepped even closer to Cooper, trying to use his height advantage to look more threatening. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, and the smell of old cigarettes grew stronger. Behind him, his two friends were now positioned in what they thought was a smart fighting formation. "You got a big mouth for someone who's about to get hurt," the leader snarled. He poked Cooper's chest with his finger, leaving a dirty mark on the white t-shirt. "Last chance to walk away, pretty boy." Cooper didn't move an inch. His eyes remained focused and calm, like they had been during firefights in Afghanistan. He noticed everything. How the leader kept shifting his weight to his back foot, how the bald biker to his left was breathing heavily, and how the smaller one to his right was nervously cracking his knuckles. "I gave you the same chance," Cooper replied quietly. "Leave these people alone and walk away." The leader laughed, showing yellow teeth. "Boys, I think this guy needs to learn some respect." He turned to the crowd that had gathered. "Everyone watch carefully. This is what happens when someone tries to play hero at our market." Mrs. Chen called out from her stall, "Please, no fighting. The police are coming." But the bikers didn't care. The leader suddenly swung his right fist at Cooper's face, putting all his weight behind the punch. It was the kind of punch that had knocked out many people before, but those people weren't trained soldiers. Cooper moved with the smooth efficiency that came from years of combat training. He shifted his head just 2 inches to the left, and the leader's fist hit nothing but air. The force of his missed punch made the leader stumble forward, exactly as Cooper had expected. "Stand still, you coward!" the leader shouted, his face red with anger and embarrassment. He swung again, and again Cooper dodged with minimal movement. It was like watching a skilled dancer avoid a clumsy partner. The bald biker decided to join in. He rushed at Cooper from the left, trying to grab him in a bear hug. Cooper simply stepped aside and stuck out his foot. The bald man's momentum did the rest, sending him crashing into a wooden table of flower pots. The pots fell and broke, spilling dirt and flowers everywhere. "He's making us look stupid," the smallest biker yelled. "Get him!" He pulled out a small knife from his pocket, its blade glinting in the morning sun. Several people in the crowd gasped. Mrs. Park covered her eyes. Mrs. Chen was still on the phone with the police, describing everything that was happening. Cooper's expression didn't change, but his stance shifted slightly. In Afghanistan, he had faced enemies with much more dangerous weapons than a small knife. He watched as the small biker waved the knife back and forth, trying to look threatening, but actually showing his inexperience with weapons. "That was a big mistake," Cooper said, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge of authority. "Bringing a weapon to a flower market. Now you've turned simple harassment into armed assault." The leader looked worried for the first time. He hadn't planned on his friend pulling out a knife. This was supposed to be a simple intimidation job, collecting protection money from scared vendors. Now it had turned into something much more serious. "Put it away, Jimmy," the leader ordered, but the small biker wasn't listening. "No way, I'm not letting this guy embarrass us." Jimmy lunged forward with the knife, aiming for Cooper's midsection. Time seemed to slow down for Cooper. His combat training took over completely. He could hear his old drill sergeant's voice in his head. "Control the weapon, control the fight." He was about to show these bikers the difference between street fighting and military combat training. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Cooper prepared to deal with the knife attack. This wasn't going to be like the movies. It would be quick, efficient, and very, very real. In the split second before Jimmy's knife reached him, Cooper moved like flowing water. His left hand caught Jimmy's wrist, his grip precise and powerful from years of hand-to-hand combat training. At the same time, his right hand grabbed Jimmy's elbow. With one smooth motion, Cooper redirected the knife-wielding arm downward and twisted. The knife clattered to the ground as Jimmy let out a surprised yelp. Before anyone could blink, Cooper had Jimmy's arm locked behind his back, holding him in a standard military restraint position. Jimmy's feet weren't even touching the ground anymore. "Let me go," Jimmy shouted, his tough guy act completely gone. His face was turning red from embarrassment and discomfort. "Drop your weapon first," Cooper said calmly, though everyone could hear the steel in his voice. "You're already in enough trouble." The knife lay on the ground, catching the sunlight. The leader and the bald biker stood frozen, not sure what to do. They had never seen anyone move so fast or with such precision. "This is your last chance," Cooper announced, his voice carrying across the now silent market. "Leave now, or I'll have to show you what else they taught me in the army." The leader's face switched between different emotions: anger, fear, and uncertainty. His hands kept opening and closing into fists. The bald biker was slowly backing away, already thinking about running. "You can't take all of us," the leader shouted, but his voice shook slightly. He was trying to sound brave, but everyone could hear his confidence crumbling. Cooper smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that soldiers gave when they knew they had complete control of a situation. "Actually, I can. Would you like me to demonstrate?" To prove his point, Cooper slightly adjusted his grip on Jimmy, who immediately squeaked in pain. It was a perfectly controlled move. Enough pressure to cause discomfort, but not actual harm. Mrs. Chen had stopped talking on her phone and was now recording everything on her cell phone camera. Other people in the crowd had their phones out too. Some were calling the police, while others were filming what was happening. "The police are 3 minutes away," Mrs. Chen announced loudly. "I can hear their sirens." The leader looked around nervously. Things had gone very wrong. This was supposed to be an easy day of collecting money from scared vendors. Instead, they were being humiliated by someone who was clearly a trained professional. "Let Jimmy go, and we'll leave," the leader said, trying to sound like he was making a deal rather than begging. Cooper shook his head. That's not how this works. First, you're going to pick up this knife and place it on that table. He nodded toward Mrs. Park's flower stand. Then you're going to take out your wallets and leave enough money to pay for all the damage you've caused. Only then will I consider letting your friend go. The bald biker had already reached the edge of the market. He looked at his leader, waiting to see what to do. The leader's face was a storm of emotions as he realized how completely they had lost control of the situation. In the distance, police sirens were getting louder. Several people in the crowd were smiling now, enjoying watching the bullies get what they deserved. Mrs. Park had stopped crying and was watching with satisfaction as the biker's tough image crumbled. "Tick-tock," Cooper said calmly. "Those sirens are getting closer. The longer you wait, the worse this looks. Right now, you're only facing charges for vandalism and attempted assault. Don't make it worse." The leader's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew they were trapped. Slowly, he reached for his wallet, but Cooper's sharp voice stopped him. "Carefully," Cooper warned. "Remember, I've dealt with people much more dangerous than you. Any sudden moves, and your friend here will be taking a very uncomfortable nap." The next few moments would decide whether this situation ended peacefully or became much more serious. Cooper was ready for either outcome. The leader of the bikers moved very slowly, pulling his wallet out with 2 fingers. His face was red with shame as he counted out several $100s and placed them on Mrs. Park's table. The money would cover the broken pots and damaged flowers. "Now the knife," Cooper reminded him, still holding Jimmy in the secure hold. The small biker had stopped struggling, finally accepting that he couldn't break free from Cooper's trained grip. The leader bent down carefully and picked up the knife with his thumb and index finger. He placed it on the table next to the money, then stepped back with his hands raised. "Good choice," Cooper said. "Now apologize to Mrs. Park and Mrs. Chen." "What? No way." The leader started to protest, but Cooper slightly adjusted his hold on Jimmy, making him whimper. The leader quickly changed his mind. I'm sorry," he mumbled, looking at the ground. "Louder," Cooper commanded. "And look at them when you apologize." The leader turned to face the 2 elderly vendors. "I'm sorry for causing trouble and breaking your things," he said clearly this time. His face was burning with embarrassment. Some people in the crowd were recording this on their phones, and he knew this video would destroy his tough reputation. The police sirens were very close now. The bald biker, who had been slowly backing away, suddenly turned and ran toward his motorcycle. He started the engine with shaking hands. "Let him go," Cooper said to the crowd as some people moved to stop the bald biker. "The police have his license plate number from all these videos." The bald biker roared away on his motorcycle, leaving his friends behind. The leader watched him go with a look of betrayal on his face. First, they had been humiliated by this soldier, and now his own friend was abandoning them. 2 police cars pulled up to the market entrance, their lights flashing. 4 officers stepped out, hands on their weapons as they assessed the situation. Mrs. Chen hurried over to explain what had happened, showing them the video on her phone. "Are you military?" one of the officers asked Cooper, noticing his stance and the way he was controlling Jimmy. "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant James Cooper, U.S. Army," Cooper replied. "This man attacked me with a knife after they were harassing vendors and destroying property. The knife is on that table, along with money they paid for damages." The officers quickly took control of the situation. They handcuffed Jimmy as Cooper released him from the hold. The leader didn't resist as they put handcuffs on him too. Both bikers looked defeated and embarrassed. As the police led them away, Cooper noticed his yellow roses were still safely on the table where he had placed them. Not a single petal was damaged. Mrs. Chen hurried over to him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant Cooper," she said, straightening her hat. "We've been afraid of those men for months. Nobody else dared to stand up to them." Mrs. Park joined them, nodding in agreement. "You are a true hero," she said, picking up the money the leader had left. "Please, let me share this with you. You saved us from those terrible men." Cooper shook his head with a gentle smile. "Keep it, Mrs. Park. Use it to buy new pots and flowers. Maybe some extra security cameras, too." He picked up his roses, checking to make sure they were still fresh for his mother. Other vendors and shoppers came to thank him, many wanting to shake his hand or take pictures with him. Cooper remained humble, saying he had only done what anyone would do. But everyone knew that wasn't true. It had taken someone with his special training and courage to stand up to the bikers. A young boy tugged at Cooper's shirt. "Mister, are you really a soldier?" he asked with wide eyes. "That was so cool how you stopped the bad guys." Cooper knelt down to the boy's level. "Yes, I am. But remember, fighting is always the last option. The most important thing is standing up for what's right and protecting people who need help." The police officers asked Cooper to come to the station to give a formal statement. Before leaving, he helped the vendors clean up the mess from the fight. As he picked up broken pottery pieces, Mrs. Chen insisted on giving him a second bouquet of yellow roses. "For your bravery," she said firmly when Cooper tried to refuse. "Your mother should know what a good son she raised." At the police station, Cooper sat in a small interview room with Detective Sarah Martinez. She had been tracking the Night Wolves motorcycle gang for months, but none of their victims had ever been willing to testify. "You've done us a huge favor, Sergeant Cooper," Detective Martinez said, typing his statement into her computer. "These guys have been terrorizing small businesses all over the city, but now we have video evidence, multiple witnesses, and an attempted assault with a weapon." Cooper described everything that had happened, his military training helping him remember every detail. "The leader's name is Mike Davidson," Detective Martinez told him. "He has a long record of similar incidents, but he always managed to scare people into dropping charges." "Not this time," Cooper said firmly. "I'll testify, and I'm sure Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Park will too. They're tired of being afraid." In another room, Mike Davidson was realizing how much trouble he was in. The police had found more weapons in his motorcycle saddlebags, along with notebooks listing all the businesses they had been extorting money from. Jimmy, the small biker with the knife, had already confessed everything, hoping for a lighter sentence. He told the police about all their illegal activities, including the protection money scheme they had been running for the past year. Detective Martinez showed Cooper some photos on her computer. "We've identified the third biker who ran away. His name is Tom Wilson. Patrol cars are looking for him now." She smiled. "They'll adapt he'll show his face in that market again." As Cooper finished giving his statement, he heard familiar voices in the station lobby. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Park had arrived with several other vendors from the market. They'd all wanted to file reports about previous incidents with the Night Wolves. "See what you started," Detective Martinez said admiringly. "Sometimes people just need to see one person stand up to bullies. It gives them courage to stand up too." Cooper thought about all the times in Afghanistan when his unit had helped local villagers stand up to people who were trying to intimidate them. It felt good to know he could still make that kind of difference back home. The vendors had brought food with them, boxes of dumplings from Mrs. Chen's daughter's restaurant, and fresh pastries from Mr. Garcia's bakery near the market. Soon the police station lobby felt like a community celebration. "My sister works at the local news station," one young officer told Cooper. "She'd love to interview you about what happened. This is exactly the kind of positive story people need to hear." But Cooper politely declined. "The story isn't about me," he said. "It's about good people finding the courage to stand up for their community. That's what matters." As the afternoon went on, more people from the market arrived to file reports. Each one had a story about the Night Wolves' intimidation tactics. Detective Martinez and her team worked quickly, taking statements and collecting evidence. "You know they'll probably get lawyers and try to fight the charges," Detective Martinez warned Cooper. "Let them try," Cooper replied calmly. "I've faced worse threats than lawyers. Besides, it's hard to argue with video evidence and dozens of witnesses." Finally, after all the paperwork was done, Cooper picked up his 2 bouquets of yellow roses. They were still fresh, protected by wet paper towels that Mrs. Chen had wrapped around their stems. As he walked to his car, Cooper thought about how he would tell this story to his mother. She had always taught him to help others, but she also worried about him getting hurt. Today, he had proven that his military training could protect not just his country, but also his local community. Cooper drove home with the 2 bouquets of yellow roses carefully placed on his passenger seat. The afternoon sun made the flowers glow like small pieces of captured sunshine. As he drove, his phone kept buzzing with text messages from his army buddies. Someone had already uploaded videos of the flower market incident to social media. "Mom's going to see this for sure," he thought, knowing how quickly news spread in their small community. His mother Sarah worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and her coworkers were always showing her videos and news stories on their phones during break time. When he pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, he saw his mother's car was already there. She wasn't supposed to be home from her shift for another hour. Cooper grabbed the roses and walked to the front door, hearing familiar voices inside. As he opened the door, he found his mother sitting in the living room with Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Park. They had beaten him home and were sharing cups of tea while telling Sarah Cooper all about her son's heroic actions at the market. James. His mother stood up when he entered. Her eyes were shining with tears of pride. "Why didn't you tell me you were going to the flower market today? I would have come with you." "It was supposed to be a surprise," Cooper said, holding out the roses. "Happy birthday, Mom." Sarah hugged her son tightly, careful not to crush the beautiful flowers. "The roses are lovely, but hearing about what you did today, that's the best birthday gift a mother could ask for." Mrs. Chen smiled warmly. "Your son is a hero, Mrs. Cooper. Those bad men had been bothering us for months. Nobody dared to stop them until James stood up to them. He was so brave," Mrs. Park added, wiping her eyes with a tissue, "but also very careful. He didn't hurt those men more than necessary, even when they tried to attack him with a knife." Sarah's face went pale at the mention of the knife, and Cooper quickly stepped in. "Mom, everything was under control. My training helped me handle the situation safely." They all sat down, and Cooper's mother insisted on hearing the whole story. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Park took turns telling different parts, praising Cooper's courage and skill. They described how calm he had remained throughout the entire incident. "Just like his father," Sarah said softly, touching the gold locket she always wore around her neck. Inside was a picture of Cooper's father in his police uniform, taken shortly before the accident that took his life. "Dad would have done the same thing," Cooper said, putting his arm around his mother's shoulders. Mrs. Chen reached into her large handbag and pulled out a carefully wrapped package. "We brought something else for your birthday, Mrs. Cooper." All the vendors at the market contributed. Inside the package was a beautiful photo album. The first page had a picture of the flower market on a sunny morning, with all the vendors standing together and smiling. There was a blank space in the middle. "For today's newspaper photo," Mrs. Park explained, "they're running a story about what happened. We want you to have this memory of how your son helped our community." Sarah Cooper looked at her son with proud tears in her eyes. "When you joined the army, I was so worried about you being in danger. But you were right. All that training wasn't just for fighting wars. It was about protecting people who need help, whether they're across the world or right here at home." Cooper smiled, remembering what his drill sergeant had told him during basic training. A soldier's duty doesn't end when he leaves the battlefield. True warriors protect their communities wherever they are. As the afternoon sun filled the living room with warm light, Cooper listened to the women chatting and laughing together. The yellow roses stood in a crystal vase on the coffee table, their sweet fragrance filling the air. This wasn't how he had planned to spend his mother's birthday, but somehow it had turned out even better than he imagined. 1 month had passed since the incident at the flower market. The Sunday morning air was crisp and clear as Cooper walked through the market's entrance, carrying a cup of coffee. The place had changed quite a bit in just 4 weeks. New security cameras watched over the market from several angles, paid for by the money recovered from the Nightwolves gang. Colorful banners hung between the stalls, and there were more shoppers than ever before. The story of how a soldier had stood up to the bikers had brought new customers who wanted to support the local vendors. Mrs. Chen waved from her stall as Cooper approached. Her display was bigger now, with even more varieties of flowers. "Good morning, Sergeant Cooper," she called out cheerfully. "The usual?" Cooper nodded with a smile. Every Sunday since the incident, he had made it a tradition to buy fresh flowers for his mother. But he wasn't the only one with this new tradition. He noticed several other regular customers doing the same thing. "Did you see the newspaper yesterday?" Mrs. Park asked from her neighboring stall. "They sentenced those 2 bikers. Mike Davidson got 5 years in prison, and Jimmy got 3 years with counseling. The third biker, Tom Wilson, had been caught trying to leave the state. He had turned witness against his former friends in exchange for a lighter sentence. The Nightwolves gang had completely fallen apart, and other similar groups in the area had quickly disappeared." "Detective Martinez called to thank us again," Mrs. Chen said as she wrapped Cooper's flowers. She said our case helped them solve 12 other incidents of gang intimidation in the city. Other business owners aren't afraid to speak up anymore. Cooper looked around the market, noticing all the positive changes. Mr. Garcia's bakery stall had doubled in size. Mrs. Park's orchids were winning ribbons at local flower shows. Even the parking lot had been repaved, with fresh lines painted and better lighting installed. A group of young children ran past, wearing plastic army helmets and pretending to be soldiers protecting the market. Their parents watched with amused smiles. Cooper had heard that local teachers were using the flower market story to teach children about standing up to bullies and protecting their community. Oh, I almost forgot. Mrs. Chen reached under her counter and pulled out a framed newspaper article. It showed a photo of all the market vendors standing together, smiling proudly. The headline read, "Local hero brings peace to historic flower market." "We're putting it up by the entrance," she explained, "to remind everyone that one person's courage can change an entire community." Cooper felt slightly embarrassed by all the attention, but he understood why it was important to the vendors. His actions had given them back their dignity and security. His mother had framed the same article at home, putting it next to his father's police badge. As he walked through the market, Cooper noticed other changes too. New vendors had joined, bringing fresh energy to the community. A coffee cart now offered free drinks to police officers and military personnel. Local art students had painted beautiful murals on the market walls, turning the once plain space into a colorful attraction. Sergeant Cooper. A small voice called out. It was Tommy, Mrs. Chen's grandson, running toward him in his own tiny military uniform. "Mom got me this because I want to be brave like you when I grow up." Cooper knelt down to the boy's level. "Remember what I told you about being brave, Tommy? It's not about fighting. It's about standing up for what's right and protecting people who need help." Tommy finished the sentence proudly. The boy's mother smiled gratefully at Cooper. Like many others in the community, she had found new confidence after the incident. People walked taller now, looked out for each other more, and weren't afraid to speak up when they saw something wrong. As Cooper left the market with his fresh bouquet of yellow roses, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His military training had taught him how to handle dangerous situations, but his parents had taught him the most important lesson of all, that true strength comes from using your abilities to help others. The flower market had become more than just a place to buy flowers. It was now a symbol of what could happen when one person had the courage to stand up and do what was right. The sweet scent of victory smelled just like his mother's favorite yellow roses.